Sounds good. Can you hear me at all?
Psychology that she dissipates by showing that there is a bright yellow beam. My goal will be to focus almost as a kind of footnote to her remarks on one domain of human experience, which nonetheless is universal, and that is, of course, the universal dimension of loss in its many forms. I will be talking most particularly about losses that arise in the context of ruptures of those key meaning-sustaining attachments that we form with others, and the way in which we lose those others repeatedly, inevitably, and totally in the circumstance of death, whether the death of the other or the death of ourselves. And so it is with this sobering recognition, even before my second cup of coffee in the morning, that I have to just acknowledge that at the end of the day, at the end of this conference, at the end of our lives, we will lose everyone and everything that matters to us. Every person, every place, every project, every possession. And in this respect, as the Buddhists recognize, life entails impermanence. The tragedy of human existence, in some sense, is that we are wired for attachment in a world of impermanence. It's that I'd like us to draw attention to for a bit, and I'd like to do so a little unconventionally, at least in terms of my presentations. I'm going to gesture toward research occasionally, but I'm not going to focus on it primarily. Instead, I'm going to try to follow that more playful tangent that Emmy also signaled in her remarks, in focusing on, initially, how clinically we might help people retell narratives of loss that are life-changing in the context of relationships that were once life-sustaining. How do we find a way of taking on board, of integrating into our narrative of self, relationship, and living the reality of a loved one's death, particularly when that occurs under tragic, sometimes violent, sudden, off-time circumstances. And I'm going to use that then as a launchpad for considering some creative practices that move beyond the conventional boundaries of psychotherapy into imaginative ways of not only telling these losses, but retelling them with imagination, recruiting imagination as a kind of healing modality in the context of the work that we do, not only in the psychotherapy group, but also on the broader stage of our communities, sometimes literally on that stage, as we'll see. And so I'm going to talk a little bit with you about this idea of imaginative retelling, reconstructing narratives of loss, the goal of which will be a kind of serious play, a way of attempting to introduce movement into life stories that seem to be frozen and stagnant in the aftermath of terrible losses. We'll be using then non-literal ways of dealing with strikingly realistic and literal losses in our lives. Just quite briefly, a kind of constructivist, meaning-oriented frame that helps sustain me in this work and focus on different dimensions of it, alluded to actually briefly by Gordon in his remarks, is that we can understand our quest for adaptive grieving in the face of loss to entail two narrative processes. On the one hand, we're attempting to process the event story of the death of someone we love and have lost, or someone who was a significant attachment figure, even if the relationship was problematic or even deeply oppressive or abusive. And in this respect, we're trying to wrap our hearts and minds around what this means and what this means for us in our ongoing lives. Where now do we find those thoughts, those sources of meaning that once were anchored in that intimate relation? But likewise, we are also attempting to not merely process the event story of the death, but to access the backstory of our relationship with the one who we have loved and lost. In a sense, to bring that forward, perhaps into therapy with a trusted counselor, perhaps into conversation with a family or community, as we find ways of keeping that person's stories alive. We do so in order to restore a sense of secure connection, attachment, a kind of holding environment in a way that allows us to maintain a non-literal sense of connection to this person. And we do so as well, particularly in the context of therapy, when we're trying to address unfinished business, unresolved relational issues that long outlive the literal relationship. As we do so, we move toward a grief that is integrated, meaning it's not just something we get over. It remains a part of life. It remains a kind of room in the larger home of our existence. And occasionally, that grief will knock on the door and ask to be admitted to the main room in which we are now living. It entails access to bittersweet emotions that continue to evolve as we do, as we attempt to change the way in which we hold the loved one in our life. No longer is she or he available at the breakfast table or in the bedroom with us. Now we confront their very present absence in the empty chair or space alongside us that they once occupied. We move toward a coherent narrative of the loss, a way of trying to make sense of what has transpired, a story that makes room for the nasty bits, the parts that are difficult to articulate, to own, to share with others. And we seek the compassionate audience of others so that we need not bear those as silent stories in our own hearts and minds alone. As we do the work of redefining those life goals and roles that now must change because life requires this constant adaptation and engagement with the wheel of change and not a freezing of time. A great deal of research that we and others have done tends to substantiate the importance of this central concern with reorganizing life stories, with making meaning in the wake of tragic losses, both death-related and non-death related, as in the loss of relationships, health, beliefs, countries of origin, physical abilities, life potentials. And we find across dozens of such studies, both studying extemporary or rather contemporaneous relations between meaning-making and grief or trauma symptomatology, and also prospective studies that predict how people will do months or even years down the road on the basis of their capacity to make meaning of the loss now. We find that the idea of sense-making, meaning-making, predicting better adaptation applies across a host of circumstances of loss, such as palliative care, where people are anticipating the death of a loved one, in the relation to natural death losses, violent death losses, as through suicide, homicide, fatal accident. And it holds equally across many different populations of bereaved parents who have lost a child, older spouses who have lost a life partner, young people contending with a variety of losses. The literature is substantial and consistent in suggesting that this is perhaps the strongest marker of adaptive grieving. And so I want to talk about a few contributions to that. First, I want to salute my colleague on your right, Ted Rynearson, a psychiatrist who developed a procedure called restorative retelling, a very constructivist, meaning-oriented practice, tragically being motivated to develop this following the death of his wife, Julie, the suicide, when he was just beginning his career in psychology. And in the context of her experiencing a profound postpartum depression after the delivery of her first child, she ended her life despite the best attempts at psychiatric and psychological intervention. The work that he began has been continued by many others, diversified, deepened, and of course modified in light of the individual skills and frameworks of therapy or specific domains of clinical concern that each of us might have. And so in this respect, I want to also salute my colleague Jack Jordan, who, like me, practices forms of restorative retelling. Jack does so particularly in the context of his specialization in suicide bereavement. We could add others to the Holy Trinity up here as I predicted, because ultimately it takes community to construct a practice. We make individual innovations in a broader scheme. And so here I'd like to touch briefly on restorative retelling in tense conception with contributions by myself, by Jack, and by others that I won't bother to acknowledge the prominence of in each case for a long time. I'll give you a couple of minutes, just a sense of what this might sound like in working with a client on my own. I'll then reach into talking about two forms of imaginative retelling that go beyond the literal work that restorative retelling features. And we'll do this all within the span of time available. In doing this work, I use the mnemonic of bracing, pacing, and facing to describe the practice. Bracing is the act of supporting people within sessions with practices of emotion regulation when the story that they're telling about the stillbirth of their child, about the overdose of their brother, about the suicide of their mother, become overwhelming for them. We help them somehow hold the story, but also hold the strong and passionate feeling that rises almost to a level that they might drown in. We help them regulate that, increasing their window of tolerance for negative affect as they seek to make sense of sometimes apparently meaningless losses. We do this equally by helping them construct practices between sessions in which they might review and revise those very same stories that they have told us and that they have perhaps even recorded with our invitation on their own smartphones as they relate the story in slow motion detail. The manner of this retelling then as a therapeutic practice to help people accommodate hard stories of loss focuses on a pacing that is deliberate and slow, that asks for what happens between the lines of the conventional story that people offer as a quick sum up to the tragic loss that they've had when others say, "How are you doing?" or "What happened?" Instead, we want to greatly unpack that. It becomes not a story told in a couple of minutes, but a story that might span several hours, several sessions of intimately engaged listening and asking the questions that reveal deeper and deeper levels of emotion and meaning in the course of the work. We consider the dosing of this retelling. We try to calibrate that to the level of tolerance of particular clients, not all of whom can stand in the face of strong and disruptive emotion for the same period of time. And with this kind of slow motion review then, we help people face what life sometimes darkly requires, and that is the reality of great suffering, sometimes the suffering implicated in the wasting illness that took our loved one from us, one neuron at a time, as a demented condition, one breath at a time, in COPD, one cell at a time, in cancer. Sometimes it may be a psychological suffering that reaches a climax and a desperate act of suicide. And as we stand then as non-anxious witnesses, willing to hear what others are not, we help people seek empowerment in that very experience of being able to at least now offer the story of what has transpired, not merely to be a victim in it. So it is this work then that I want to briefly illustrate. I'll do so with reference to a case of a client of mine who prefers that I use her actual name. Her name is Gail, and she lost her son, Max, in a tragic automobile accident as Max and two other young people returned to university following a holiday break. As the car somehow left the road, crashed, rolled over several times, Max was thrown from the vehicle, ultimately was medevac by helicopter to a distant trauma center, along with the two other young people. But across the course of 4 days, he died in hospital, gradually with the brain damage that he sustained in that accident, taking his life as the cortex shut down and then progressively deeper brain centers. The story that we'll hear, Gail open up here, that she gives me permission to share, reason she has selected these few minutes to share with you is the recording on her smartphone of our work in session as she receives this tragic phone call in the midst of her own board meeting with the organization she was running. She steps out, takes the call to hear a voice on the other end saying, "I have some bad news." As she receives the call from the hospital, the distant trauma center, and she prepares them to organize herself and her family to go be with herself in this extreme condition. I don't mean to trigger anyone else's experiences of trauma or loss. This may be an excellent time to go out and check and see if the coffee is available around the corner. If you prefer not to hear these 2 or 3 minutes of her engagement with me, you'll softly hear my voice in the background. Her voice will be more prominent because the microphone's pointing toward her on her phone. The goal of this is to stand in the presence of this hard story to help her do so. We will hear when her emotion begins to move from an almost dissociated, distant engagement to one that is much more visceral. You will hear me ask the occasional soft question that helps, in some sense, engaging us in direction through this hard story, sometimes helping her back away a step and then to step back in once more. The goal here is for narrative mastery of the experience, to feel like it's a story that she can hold rather than merely a story that holds her in the presence of at least one responsive witness. I should mention the names of a couple of people. Her son, Max, the one who ultimately was critically injured in this car accident and who died 4 days later in her arms. Her son, Morgan, Max's older brother, she speaks about the phone call to him, and Mikey, the younger brother, who she protects from full knowledge of this experience.
Surprisingly, I answered him and said, "Please pray," and "Please pray, please pray." That's what I would say.
Answer the many phone calls coming in.
Yeah, and I wanted that network to go out. Please pray. I called Morgan.
The emotion begins to rise in her mouth.
Yes, sir. Yeah, because Mikey is attached to his heart right now. He's depressed. And I can tell Mikey everything. He's 17. I told him that being Rex is really hurt. And, but I could tell that Mikey couldn't take it in. And I didn't tell him everything. And that Morgan, you know, he's 23 now, and he was 32, and we have a different relationship. And I can't protect him from this. I need him to be there. I need him to come. And unfortunately, I cannot protect him. Yes, I did. He was driving in a car back from Atlanta. So I asked him if his seatbelt was fastened. The first thing I said.
And was not wearing a seatbelt.
Yeah, he did. In a really bad car accident. And he was in the airlift to Wichita, and he was in extremely critical condition. And that I needed him to drive slowly. I would keep him informed, and then the timing of this is a little off because then I saw that doctor that told me that he had a cataclysmic brain injury, and so Morgan texted me and said, what's new or what's going on, and I called him again, and that was when it was so hard because I said that word, I said Morgan, and then I was like really dealing with reality. And good morning. I'm going to tell you that I'm going to tell you what the doctor says to me because you deserve to know, and that the doctors told me that he had a cataclysmic brain injury. You need to import it. What does that mean? And I said, I think it means what it says. And cataclysmic. And he said, it's gonna die. And I said that I didn't know. But that if he gets home to Memphis, I'd arrange for him to get up there so he can be with us. And he said, Mom, I said, yeah. He said, I'm scared.
You get the feeling that that's about 4 minutes out of the 75 minutes that we gave Retelling before the see if I can advance this. So it was 4 minutes of the 75 in our first session of Retelling, which encompassed merely the first large chapter of this story, taking her to the hospital, seeing his broken body on the gurney, negotiating with the doctors about the prospect of his survival. We then took an additional 3 weeks to process what she had discovered and rediscovered in the context of that narration, to make some sense of meaning of it. Meaning at the level of a recognition of the meaning of her emotion in each moment, as well as the level of the story itself and the broader cosmic significance that it had for her in terms of her fusion spirituality, which welds both Western and Eastern traditions together in a distinctive way. We then return to the second chapter, another 75 minutes of Retelling. So this is not work for the faint of heart, but it was deeply important for her as she would acknowledge and take it in, and somehow making this tragic story part of her larger life story. We are, in addition to being practicing clinicians, we are also researchers, and so we're quite interested in how this works and how this kind of practice might be offered in a more general way, even beyond the boundaries of geography. And one such expression of this intent to broaden the method and to make it more available comes from my collaboration with Daniela Alves at the Universidade of Neimeyer in Portugal. And what we did is we mounted an internet-based therapy, one that is disseminated through very personal, intimate interactions mediated by Skype, so video conferencing throughout the Portuguese-speaking world, and in a randomized comparison of this treatment with waitlist control. What we have discovered is that a multidimensional therapy that includes this restorative retelling as one of the central narrative processes, processing the event story of the loss, using a variety of creative procedures, accessing the backstory of relationship, using other creative procedures, indeed yields quite positive outcomes. We find, for example, that in our preliminary analyses, the struggle with complicated grief, or what the World Health Organization in the International Classification of Disease, 11th edition, ICD-11, being published this year, what they call prolonged grief disorder, is reduced very substantially across the course of a 12-week program with this focus, with the intervention group moving from 100% people who meet criteria for this debilitating form of grief to nearly 17 or 18%. And likewise, we find, or I should say, in contrast, in the control group, we find very little diminishment of this prolonged and anguished grief. What I want to do, though, is to take my remaining half hour to point toward a couple of practices that take retelling in a very different direction. A direction that is no less serious for involving serious play. The first involves a collaboration with, actually, a four-way collaboration between the University of Memphis, Playback Theater, an improvisational theater troupe that gives basically voice to stories of community and returns greater life and vitality to those communities. I'll talk more about that work. We collaborated as well with the Memphis Police Department and with Lifeline to Success, an offender reorientation program, reintegration program, as after people have done hard time for hard crime. The idea was, in this work, to use audience-inspired improvisation where members of a specific audience that I'll describe would relate their stories of trauma and loss. And these would then be performed in their dramatic essence in terms of the emotional themes, using a metaphor, using movement, using brief snippets of dialogue, improvisationally in an unscripted way on stage for not only the storyteller to witness, but also a larger appreciative audience of that story. The work of playback strongly embodies emotion, and I mean this in the literal sense of the use of the actors' bodies to express and convey the complex and often multi-dimensional emotions that are entailed in a given circumstance or scenario that can be heavy, that can be light, that can be everything in between. In this work, we're responding to a climate, particularly in the United States, that has been highly toxic now for many years. The kind of climate that exists between police and the communities that they are charged to serve, but with whom they often have very fractious, difficult, conflicted, distrustful, and sometimes deadly relations, as violence on both sides is dramatized in news headlines regarding police killings of people who are, in fact, not a moral danger. And so is this climate that we're attempting to intervene in a creative way. We engaged Lifeline to Success as partners in this. This is an existing program, an offender reintegration program, as I mentioned. The goal is to work with men and women, because Memphis is an African-American city. Indeed, the participants, including the leaders of this work, are African-American colleagues, as are the police, interestingly enough. So the tensions that exist within the community between police and those they serve are rarely along racial lines, but they are lines of division that are equally deep and equally deadly. they're in a kind of Okay, I didn't do that, did I, Dan? So I'll let Dan modulate the sound until it comes back to a good level for all of you. This is a kind of performance that is accompanied by live music. Active, our African-American musician, accompanies much of the work as a kind of improvisational underscore to the work. What I want to do, though, is to share with you a little bit of the work that we did. Let you just hear a few minutes of this. It's remarkable because what we did is we used playback theater to perform the stories of people whose lives would have been led typically in poverty, in crime, drug-saturated, often highly violent. They often may have been involved in gang killings and so on. These were people who were being reintegrated into the community. Then they were working with police officers, both women and men, who of course also led lives that were saturated in violence. They themselves often came from the very same communities, and yet they had chosen a different path for life, one that had greatly divided them. And of course, the violence in these lives often was between these two different groups. What we did is we conducted separate peacemaking circles, as they were called, in which both communities separately were taught principles of nonviolent communication. And then they were brought together as their stories were dramatically performed by playback actors. Their stories were lost in trauma, perhaps on the job, perhaps in their home of origin, in a way that those stories could be made visible and be validated by members of both communities. And then we train each of these two communities, the cops and the robbers, to perform the stories of the other, where they actively became the other in telling these stories, in living them out dramatically using playback procedures. Here you will see one of the earliest examples of that. So it's very crude, it doesn't take on the more fully artistic form that characterizes their work. Let's see if I can move forward. If we could advance the slide back there. This isn't
And so we responded myself and my partner. This probably has been 8 years ago, but I can remember like 8 minutes ago. We responded to the call, and my partner got on the scene, and house full of kids, and a lot of grown people shouting, crying, and falling all out. And there was a little boy, he was about 7 years old, he was shot in the chest. And there was a guy who was shot in the shoulder, the arm. He was fine, he was walking around holding his arm. But the little boy, the caravans, they all showed up at the same time as officers did. So when we were there, the firefighters grabbed the little boy up, instead of putting him on a stretcher or anything like that, they snatched him up, ran out to the ambulance. I'm following behind them. Because we have to get pyramids done to a hospital and transport to, but everybody in the hospital questions, we were just like, we got to get this boy to the hospital. So I remember running out the front door, behind us, looking up at the pyramids, and the driver, he was all driving down the street, and like the firefighters were hanging out the door, hanging to close the door, and trying to pull this little boy and get to the bottom. Well, so I go back in the house, and I'm talking to the mother, and we're like, what happened? What happened? My mom said, I'm from Chicago. I have 5 kids. And, we came down here to stay with my sister for a weekend because my wife lived in Chicago and I had no family, so I had to come and stay down here with Memphis with my sister. Well, the sister, when we found out that further investigation, the sister was having an affair with a guy at her job. And she tried to bring it out, and in the process of bringing it out, he didn't want it to end. So he came to her house, knocked on her door. Her husband answered the door, and shot him. When he opened the door, that's how he got shot in the shoulder. And he came in the house and looked for her. When she stood up and saw the shot her husband, she fell to the ground, and the boy was sitting on the couch while he got moved in his chest. Okay. So now, my lieutenants on scene said, okay, somebody got to get to the hospital with the boy. The officers are in a rage. They want to find this guy so bad because, you know, family in the hospital. She was by herself. Was crime scene in her house. Her husband had to go to another hospital. So she was being questioned by detectives. So it's his mom, it's my partner, and we're talking to her. And she's like, I can't believe this is happening. Well, the doctors and surgeons that came in like a TV show, pulled down their masks and said, ma'am, I'm sorry, you did it.
The emotion finally breaks through. Now, one of the offenders will come out and get tissues for her. This is for the officer who is in deep grief.
And my partner, he's a white guy. And you know, white officers have such a hard time because people don't like they don't like you, white guys, you know, white people. Yeah, you cry and their arms clap. And we felt so helpless. And she was in shock. We were free after work, and she did. But she was in shock naturally. And they needed her to come and identify his body. You know, I guess it's just protocol. You gotta come see the body and say yes. So they gave us a minute and we went with her. So
Let's advance the slide. Now we see a brief performance.
bringing her whole
Spontaneous in that moment.
heart to her job and what it's like to be in the midst of trauma with the ones you're trying to help and feel so helpless.
Two offenders in the middle. Virginia Murphy, the director of playback, giving the orientation. My student, Melissa Smigelski, stepping into the performance. Enacting the scene in the hospital room where the young boy is dying.
We're going to hear something. What you may not see is we heard too. What you may not be able to see underneath this bag is we heard too.
The young man who stepped forward was frozen in a kind of fear and guilt because he had been in situations of violence in which he had pulled that trigger. And he was just existentially frozen in that moment. Virginia came forward and spoke for him. Whether or not you could understand all of the words in that is less important than understanding the emotion in it and the way in which a narration of a police officer's suffering began to penetrate the hearts of the offenders and vice versa in a way that made possible the construction of a very different police-community relation. Indeed, now these stories have been performed for the command line of the Memphis police force. It's been integrated into every training of every officer, who are themselves then witnesses to the playback performance of the lives of those communities that they serve, as well as their own suffering. And they themselves develop skills, empathic skills particularly, as playback actors stepping into those often violence and loss of saturated lives. We have evidence across now 3 rounds of doing this work with increasingly large groups of officers and offenders. We find a move for a greater meaning-making in participants from pre- to post-intervention routinely. This is especially visible among the offenders who are able to make meaning of their own life losses and experiences. Let me advance the slide, please. Could we advance the slide? Okay. Okay, good. Seems to no longer be working for me. Most particularly and most strikingly, we use something called an allophilia scale that looks at the degree to offenders are rating the police officers before and after the training, and the police officers are rating the offenders. And what we find across all three iterations of this is exactly the same thing. You find an immense increase in alophilia for both groups. They come to humanize the other with whom they have entered into this deep kind of existential dialogue. And so this is the work of playback, joining communities, joining hands across divisions of sometimes ethnicity, social position, and various places in the community. Another community project that I want to mention that has its own creative elements is actually done in collaboration, not with partners in Memphis, Tennessee, but in New York City, where we partnered with the Zen Center for Contemplative Care, a Buddhist organization associated with Beth Israel Hospital, to offer what we call the Mustard Seed Project. Robert Chodo Campbell, one of the monks, served as the co-therapist for us in a weekend workshop organized around meaning-oriented themes. It's called the Mustard Seed Project, based on a Buddhist sutra, in which a young mother comes to recognize the universality of loss and death in all of the homes of the village as she struggles with her own bereavement over the loss of her child. This is the brainchild largely of Polly Young Eisengren, a 45-year practitioner of Buddhism and a psychologist, a Jungian psychologist, in collaboration with me. What we did is we offered a weekend-long workshop to people in New York. And being New Yorkers, they were incredibly diverse with respect to ethnicity, nationality, faith tradition or lack thereof, usually Latin. There were a few Buddhists in the room, but most were secular, often secular Jews. The work consisted of brief meditation interspersed throughout the weekend, Buddhist Dharma lessons delivered by Chodo, the Buddhist monk, and Pali around these themes of dukkha, anicca, and anatta, the universality of suffering, the reality of impermanence in all of our lives, and an extended definition of self that is far more relational and contextual. We cultivated practices of deep listening to the stories of others in order to voice those stories for others to hear. And we made use of various expressive arts methods, most particularly poetry. We can advance the slide. As people then would read poems that were evocative of themes of loss and resilience, and share their own stories, share the response to these poems, both in small groups and larger ones. Next slide, please. What we did as we had people listen to the poems, which we would read in the voices of multiple participants, is they would select a few phrases, about 5 or 6, from a given poem that were especially meaningful or evocative for them. We then used those to sample a virtual dream story, as I will describe it in a few minutes. In the work then, we wove in the notion that loss entails a kind of challenge to the deep themes of our lives, that grieving entails a process of reaffirming or reconstructing a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss. We adopted a strong narrative theme, focusing on the reconstruction of such meanings. And one way in which we did this, if we could advance the slide, is let's go back to this, if we double click there. Was using these virtual dream stories, which basically were structured by the author. The author was each person in the group, and people were enjoying to write a story, literally write a story in that moment, which made use of 5 words from the poem that they had highlighted, and that included the phrase, "a door closes." This is the first of 2 virtual dream stories. This one is done early in the workshop. I thought it would be interesting to share with you one of those virtual dream stories in which people metaphorically address themes of loss that are relevant to their life and very often to the lives of others in the room, even though the literal story of loss may not be told. So this is a thematic narrative, not necessarily one that is organized around a literal plot, a literal event, such as the retellings we've heard before in playback or in retelling. In this case, it is about a literal event, and that is the death of a mother, but it takes on a metaphorical kind of structure. And I want to share this with you. Again, people are given a mere 8 minutes to write the story, and then in an unedited way to share it in small groups, and then to foster greater discussion in the larger group. In this case, the author is a woman who was in her 50s, and her mother, about 80, had died. She chose kind of phrases from various poems: sun porch, chocolate, happen, solitude, souls, dreams. These were some of the terms that she found a way of working into the story. And again, an 8-minute story. You know, if you could kind of watch my hand, and if I just signal you can advance, that would be great. And she entitled it, "In Our Flannel Pajamas." My sister and I sat on the sun porch on a cold January day, an odd concept made possible by the brilliance and heat of the sun shining in a clear blue sky. The beauty of the calm day followed days of tempestuous weather that had shredded any remaining dry leaves that had clung to the trees surrounding the house, so that the bare branches lifted to the sky, the sleeping trees giving no indication of the spring was to come. We laughed and reveled in the warmth, and ate chocolate and whatever else remained of our food supply, and waited for what was said to happen: the restoration of telephone service, the snow plow that would break through the drifts, ending our time of enforced solitude, and return to our separate lives, changed by our brush with death, the fear of freezing if we could not keep the fire going or ran out of wood for the stove. We were changed by our souls' shared terrors and the truths we told to keep each other awake. Our dreams were sure to contain memories of these days. The snowplow came. We packed and said goodbye, packed our cars, and closed the door to our mother's house for the last time. A touching story, and there were many such, often very artfully expressed, in a way that expressed the thematic and emotional needs of stories that people could link back to their own lives, while in a sense wearing the protective mask of make-believe, of imagination, to address those themes with less vulnerability than would be required to initially share them in the most literal form. Again, the researcher in me would step forward along with the therapist in evaluating the impact of this work. It was quite dramatic. What we found is that even across the course of this brief workshop, we saw strong increases in people's capacity to make meaning of the troubling life losses that they brought forward. Maybe it was the death of a partner to AIDS on Valentine's Day. This was true for one gay man in the group. Or the loss of a 45-year career for one musician with the symphony. Astonishingly, in that case, I have to take 1 minute to tell you this. Working alongside Chodo, the Zen monk, who was very Zen and very attuned in the group. The woman who was the musician had been telling her story of career loss, the abject depression in which he had fallen. And she had never mentioned her position in the witness, what she had done. He leaned into me, as Vicky is leaning into Emmy here, and whispered and said, "She plays the cello," and pulled back. And I didn't know this, it was a wild hypothesis. And so she went ahead and told the rest of her story, and I said, "May I ask, what was your instrument?" She said, "The cello." I had lunch with him later as we were eating from our bento box as our vegetarian food. I said, how did you nail that? There are a lot of instruments in the orchestra. And he said, it was something about the voice. So, you know, in many ways we listen between and beneath the words of the stories that people tell in order to understand the deep resonance of those lives and stories. We also found a profound reduction in grief-related suffering and a diminishment of despair and in the context of this. Again, on the Hogan grief reactions checklist, referring to that sense of anxiety and separation distress. We found as well, and this is much in keeping with Emmy's remarks earlier, a profound increase in personal growth, a sense of spiritual, personal strengthening, development, greater clarity, and a sense of life purpose, emerging again from a brief but very deep and immersive weekend workshop. And so I'd like to conclude, again on a literary note, just to share with you a quote from Thornton Wilder's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Bridge of San Luis Marin, in which the main protagonist is investigating the seemingly meaningless death of several people who died as this bridge collapsed. And as he reaches the end of his investigation, an investigation that is partly around the physical reality of the death and why the bridge fell and so on, but largely around, from his Jesuit perspective, the meaning of random loss in life. He concludes with these thoughts. He says, "But soon we shall die, and all memory of those who have gone, who have left the earth, and we ourselves shall be loved for a while and then forgotten. But the love will have been enough. All those impulses of love return to the love that made them. Even memory is not necessary for love. There is a land of the living and a land of the dead, and the bridge is love, the only survival, the only meaning." Thank you for this work you do. Thank you for joining us.